Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this HVG event, all about volunteers, risk and the law. Our events are proudly sponsored by Team Kinetic, so thank you very much to them. We are delighted to be joined today by consultant Victoria Dickinson from VA Consultancy, who is going to take us through the session in a moment.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ariane. And today's session, I feel, is going to be short, and it's only 19 minutes, so that's a lot of information to give in that time. So as said, if you've got any questions, please do use them in the chat box, and as we said, we will look at them towards the end when we give them some time to Q&A. Sounds like quite a few have had quite a lot of experience in volunteering the law, because it's something we come across every time in our leadership roles with working alongside volunteers. So from my perspective, I've worked in the volunteer sector for 30 years now, and I've worked as a strategic level for some big organisations, and I've also worked as a volunteer in small grassroots volunteer organisations. I'm a trustee, and so I do my bit on the side of understanding what it's like to be on the other side in the sense of being a volunteer and what my experience is when I work alongside organisations. So I see it from both perspectives. So I hope today I'll be able to give you some more insight and maybe answer the questions that have been bobbling around in your head over the last period of time, maybe the last couple of days. You might even have experienced an issue related to this particular area. So I'm going to now share my slides with you. Okay, and hopefully everybody can see that. Excellent. So, as I said, I'm Victoria Dickinson, and this topic we're running today is volunteers, risk and the law. And just to say that I am not able to give you, obviously, legal advice, but I'm obviously here to share some good examples and case studies. And that's the thing about volunteering and the law. It is such a grey area in many respects, because there is no legal framework that we hang volunteers actually into. So effectively, I can only give you my advice in my professional capacity as an experienced volunteer leader. And it's great for us to share our stories and experiences as well. So please be free to do that when we get towards the end of this particular session. That's it. So some of the things I'd like you to get out of today is understand the legal distinction between volunteers and employees, identify key factors that may lead to a volunteer being classified as an employee, and also apply best practices to avoid blurring those boundaries of volunteers' roles. So I want to ask you, first of all, if you can pop into the chat 3 key factors that you would use to define a volunteer. So what are the 3 key factors you would say would identify a volunteer within your organisation against perhaps an employee or somebody else in your organisation? So what are the 3 factors that you would see to identify a volunteer? See what we've got so far. Okay. We got lots of nice things in our box. Let's have a look. Yeah, we got unpaid. I saw there. Yeah, no contract of employment, no fixed hours. Yeah, choose to be there. Absolutely. No material compensation. Absolutely. Yeah, lots of things about no contract and unpaid. Yeah, critical words you've got in there. Free to come and go. They give their time freely without contracts. And flexibility. Fabulous. Everybody's got exactly the right sort of wordings in there that would identify the key things for a volunteer. So let me just pop out there. So, as you rightly said, the 3 things that really are the key identifiers are, as everyone has said, is actually unpaid. But just before that, I say that as well, as I said, there is no legal definition, but there is a statement that very often people will refer to when they're talking about a volunteer, which NCBA use, and you can actually see the full definition on their website. many people refer to this as a way of defining a volunteer. But as I say, there are three key words that you would see and looking to ensure that volunteers are volunteers. So they don't receive any payment for their time and only out-of-pocket expenses. And we'll talk a little bit more about expenses a little bit later on. It must be for a cause that's benefits to others, and it's not a family member, or the individual is not gaining benefit from themselves from their volunteering, not in the sense of saying getting skills, etc., but they're not benefiting from setting up an organisation they volunteer for themselves. And it's most importantly, it has to be truly voluntary. And this is an area that sometimes gets a bit grey for some people, because it's about that people have chosen to come and volunteer. They've not been coerced, they've not been pressurised, they've not been required to do it as part of a benefit sanctions or something like that. And there have been a few ideas floated around by various authorities to suggest perhaps, and has in the past, well, people should undertake voluntary activities to gain something, particularly that enables them to access services, or there was a talk about young people of the age of 18 doing volunteering. And there's been lots of questions about whether that actually is really truly volunteering or not, because they're not choosing to do it freely. They're not choosing their hours or when they do it. So also it's important, someone also said this as well, is it's important for volunteers to be able to know that they can stop volunteering as well. So those are three things. So if you've got a question in your mind about whether this volunteer is a truly volunteer, then you need to look, are they being unpaid? Is it for your organisational benefit? Have they truly come to you free of will to come and support your organisation? When we think about when someone is a volunteer or an employee, very often there isn't one single factor that defines this. If there is an issue and it does end up going to court, or there is a legal aspect taken against what's happening in your organisation with a volunteer, the law would look at the whole picture, a bit like this jigsaw puzzle here. Each small piece on its own, it may seem completely harmless. When you fit them all together, they can create that picture that develops an employment relationship instead of a volunteering relationship. So when we start to add all those little pieces together, things like the regular hours, the support and control that you may put into place, the performance expectations, you may also putting into that jigsaw and extra benefits that you may be giving. That jigsaw can slowly start resembling that of an employed, paid employee, even though that may have never been your intention in the first place. So sometimes people do get very worried about these bits that you may have in your organisation, but the fact is, as I say, it is sitting on their own. They are acceptable and things that sometimes we have to do. Some of our volunteer roles do require a certain amount of set hours, or there may be a certain amount of supervision you may have put in place to enable that person to have the skills and knowledge and competence to do their roles. And sitting alone, they don't actually create that picture. But if you put all those elements in together, that is when you may be thinking about, are your volunteers moving into more employment type of roles? We are getting more professional. We are required to deliver things in certain ways. And therefore, we may be putting into place particular structures that support some of these elements of this jigsaw puzzle. But I really want to be clear to say it's okay to do that if you're not adding it all together to make this picture look like you're treating your volunteers as employees. So what can you do to keep those things separate, to ensure that you're not pulling it all together to say that you have created an employee relationship with a volunteer? So we look at, first of all, is the contracts part of the conversation you'll be having with volunteers. We know that volunteers should not have a contract of employment. And very often in organisations, instead of having these contracts, organisations have volunteer agreements. And they're a really good tool to have. They're like a statement of intent. They are not legally binding, and it's important to make sure that you are a two-way volunteer agreement. So what do you expect from your volunteers and what you will do to support your volunteers? So it has two sides to an agreement, like naturally there would be. So you also want to be careful when you are writing your volunteer agreement or reviewing your volunteer agreement that you are avoiding using language like you must do this or you're required or any words that imply a employment conversation. So employment terms. So you have at the beginning, you may ask and required this to enable you to fulfill this role to the best. We would like you to do these hours or these activities. So there are no musts or anything like that that starts implying and pushing a volunteer into doing something that is contractual. It's clarifying the arrangement that you have that is voluntary and unpaid. Now, some of these these agreements, people do ask volunteers to sign. But it isn't a legal entity. It is just an agreement between the two of you. And one of the advantages of actually having it signed is it enables somebody to read it, because very often we give volunteers lots of documents, particularly when they start out on the induction period. And we hand out documents and policies, etc. And we ask people to sign lots of things, they're doing their DBS, checks, etc. So effectively, if they're giving something to sign, they will often read it. It has a really good tool as well to remind volunteers what the expectations were of them to undertake their volunteering with you as an organisation. You could refer to your values, your expectations, all those things are really handy to have in it. But bearing in mind, a contract isn't always a piece of paper. Contract could be a verbal agreement. When you continuously behave in a particular way or the expectations for a volunteer are continuous, you can also say that there was a verbal contract. So just because you don't have it written down, even as a volunteer agreement, but you do treat your volunteers in a particular way on a continuous basis, that also implies that you have developed a contractual relationship with your volunteers. So best be mindful how you set that up. The next part really is about those benefits and expenses. It's really important to understand that volunteers obviously are entitled to out-of-pocket expenses. Now, bearing in mind, I know this very difficult time for organisations. Sometimes organisations are not able to give volunteers any sort of expenses. And it's a very tricky one because actually, if we don't give volunteers expenses, we are also excluding some people from volunteering for your organisations, because not everyone can have the luxury of paying for public transport or all the other expenses that may be involved in volunteering for you. So it is good practice to have expenses given to your volunteers. And those benefits and out-of-pocket expenses can cover a range of things. They can include, as I say, travel. And I think that's one of the basic ones that organisations should offer volunteers to enable them to access your volunteering opportunities. But also some organisations will also give a lunch voucher or a lunch given to them as well, because they may be volunteering for them all day. You may need to provide PPE for an organisation or particular equipment that may be something they need to enable them to do their particular volunteering. I've worked alongside organisations who have befriending schemes and have provided the types of mobile phone to keep in contact and paid phone bills. So you need to think about that when you're setting up a volunteer programme in the first place. What are the expenses related to that for a volunteer? And being very clear that these are out-of-pocket expenses for an individual. But this is about avoiding any sort of flat rate or thank you gifts that could also be considered as a wage. Now, it's really important that we do say thank you to our volunteers and recognise their contribution to what they do for an organisation. But if you're giving high-level gifts to your volunteers, they could be perceived to be a an extra income to that individual. And you would be difficult to say that that isn't now moving into more of an employee relationship, because it's beyond what they actually need to fulfill their volunteering role with you. So expenses are out of pocket, and you may have a volunteer expenses policy, which I will refer to later on. So yes, avoiding that, making sure it's purely out of pocket, no flat rates, and no over the top gifts or expenditure, or giving anybody flat rates. Expectations. This is an important part we referred to earlier on. So it must be set as a mutual expectations, and that's set very early on. As I referred to with the contract, when you are working and engaging with a new volunteer, and you've got that very important induction period of time, this is when you would be clear about the expectations of what the volunteer will be doing and how they will be contributing to you. So you would use that induction period of time to be very clear about what those expectations are. You may have a role description that will lay that out very clearly as well. So it's another great tool to have in your list of things when you're inducting a volunteer, to be clear about what it is you expect them to do, how often, what the requirements are for that particular role. So you can also use that when you are supporting your volunteers as well, just being clear when you are coming along and meeting up with them on a regular basis, whether it be a one-to-one or a group session. And being clear that actually a volunteer can actually leave at any time. And also a charity can end a relationship with a volunteer if situations arises that would be the best outcome of that relationship between yourself and that volunteer. So to say, setting those expectations really early on, it's really important. So it's not about control, it's more about clarity and being clear about the expectation without creating an obligation. So this obligation, this is where volunteers should not have formal obligations like an employee does. So things that we may require an employee to do would be things like fix hours, or you may have a very specific disciplinary procedure that is employment speak. So making sure your volunteers have no formal obligations. So how do we get around those things would be about mandatory rotas, because some roles you may require a volunteer to be there at a particular time. And that is acceptable if that role really requires it. And you have put that expectation out right at the beginning when you inducted them. And as I said earlier on, it may be required to fulfill that role, but it sits alone. Going back to that jigsaw puzzle part where you just had one element of that, if there is a rota requirement, but you do have flexibility within that and say, this is the hours we'd like, but if you're not able to do that, please let us know in advance. So when you're dealing with obligations as well, it's about motivation. It's about someone volunteers because they want to volunteer for you and they want to help and support you. So instead of saying that you must do these things, it's about turning it around and saying to enable you to do this role to your best ability, or to really benefit the service users, or really benefit the environment. To do a rota enables us to make sure we have cover across the board. So this is more about motivating them to understand the roles of rotas and requirements of hours, rather than an expectation you must do these things. And I said that other thing is about that integration of roles. It's about clarity of roles. So we have a situation where people will be worried about when is a volunteer, and are volunteers now doing paid staff roles? And this sometimes becomes a bit of a grey area for some organisations. But it's about understanding they are going back to the 3 requirements. They are unpaid. They're doing it for your organisation and they're doing it freely. So sometimes you may be looking at roles that have elements of staff type activities, but they are not replacing like for like. So you may be having volunteers who work alongside staff who do similar sort of roles. And that is acceptable. If there is a differential in some way that you don't have contracts, but the hours are different and the roles and activities are slightly different. So avoiding volunteers to fill staff vacancies is a really important consideration, because that is not what volunteer is here to do. But there may be roles that, as I say, they will take on activities that are similar, and then you might look at being more flexible about certain roles. Ensure that staff understands this as well and understands the value of the volunteers themselves. And this is about a partnership, and it's not about a substitution of replacing like for like. It's important that the volunteers feel part of the team and do not feel that they are taking on huge amounts of responsibility that originally in their obligations they did not sign up for, or the expectations. So there are some roles, when you think about it, in some organisations that are very high level, and they are run by volunteers. And if you think of models like the Girl Guides or the Scouts Association, very much that is led by volunteers, and they have clear distinction, though, from the staff roles and the volunteer roles. But when they joined up to be a volunteer, they understood the expectations of this role and the obligations within that. But they very much clearly have a structure in place that maintains the fact that volunteers are volunteers and the staff roles. And that's a very good model to showcase how you can have lead volunteers who have high levels of responsibility that work alongside staff that support that. But ultimately, the staff have the ultimate responsibility with the trustees, well, actually trustees, but with the CEO and the top directors of an organisation. And they will have a voice within that, they'll have influence within that. So it is important to have a clarity of role within organisations. So I'm now going to have a look at a case study where I would like you to look at these, and I'll put you into breakout rooms. And this is a case study that we're going to do, which is about James. And he works for a heritage trust, and he offers guided tours, educational workshops and events. And as a trust group, which often will happen in an organisation, they begin to rely heavily on volunteers like James. And here are some of the things he's starting to do. So I'm going to, I don't know how I'm going to do it, actually says. So if I can give you a list of what you're going to do and drop that in, can we got that? Copy. And I am going to drop that into the chat box so you can see what I'm asking you to do. Okay, then I am going to check on my screen to give you a now I've not done that, so I'm trying to think if I can. Does anybody can take a photograph of that particular case study? Because I should have most probably created it in a Word document for people to see. Are you able to help me, Rianne, about that? Thank you. So I'm going to drop that particular slide in there so that you can see it. So I'm going to drop you into breakout rooms. I want you to look at this case study and discuss in your groups, could James now be considered an employee? Which elements of his arrangements create legal risk for the hall? How could the organisation restructure or clarify his volunteer role to restore proper boundaries? Okay, so I'm going to give you 15 minutes within that, and then we'll have some feedback afterwards. Perfect, lovely. Yes, so I'd say I popped into conversations. It sounds like they were full and interesting. Because this is such a short session, I'm not going to get feedback from each group because actually that would take up so much of our time. But I hope you got some good conversations within your groups themselves. So I just want to just pop through some of the things that that you should have possibly come up with in your conversations. And hopefully that will really, I think sometimes it's about reassurance and just confirming you do know it. Because as volunteer leaders, we're very often working on our own individually, and we won't have other people around us to just check in on. So sometimes this is, yes, I'm doing a good job. Yes, I do understand this. Yes, I'm getting it right. right too. So say, as well as learning, it's reaffirmation that you are doing things extremely well in your roles as well. So the case study talked about, let me just share this here, and then tell you what, we'll have a quick cup of tea and break. So you should be able to see what is happening here now. So we've got things like employment risk indicators. Yes, you most probably saw very clearly he had regular set hours and duties. He had supervision. Supervision's a funny word because actually it's very heavily employee speak. But some roles might need more support than others. So if you had somebody who was doing befriending or who was doing something quite intense, phone lines, etc., they may need a level of supervision which is more formal than somebody who was doing a what's the right word? A fundraising event. You'd still want to support them, but it looked different. But this sounded very supervision and controlled. The expectations of attendance or ongoing commitment was very clearly in there. He was receiving benefits or flat rate payments, not just expenses. His performance work were essential to operate rather than optional support. No clear volunteer agreement distinguishing his status. So these were some of those risk indicators. So we talked about not just one thing. This has got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elements of what we were talking about from that jigsaw puzzle when we're starting to look more like we're treating him an employee. Now, the risk, as we said to the hall itself, was there's a risk of employment status claim, which means he would be entitled to sick pay, holiday pay, and minimum wage. So that is something everybody wants to steer clear of. Potential liability for back pay, holiday, and unfair dismissal. So effectively, even though he might be going forward, he could then say, well, I've been doing this for 6 months. So you'd have to back pay that person right back to when they originally started to treat him like an employee. That is a risk. National insurance and implications. So again, as an organisation, as we know that you have to pay national insurance, and which is obviously sadly increased in April this year. So again, a big financial impact on the organisation. But more importantly as well is there's that reputational damage. So actually people will say, this is not a very good organisation, and therefore you maybe have compliance issues with your funders or even your insurers as well, because you are now treating your volunteers as employees, and that status will change within your insurance as well. So how do we restore back some of these boundaries you might have looked at? Replace the contract with a non-binding volunteer agreement. Hopefully you've thought about that one. Clarifying flexible hours and no obligation to attend. Only reimburse actual expenditure, not flat payments. Refresh the role description. Focus on community support, not the core operations of your organisation, and in this case. Train supervisors to treat volunteers differently from staff. Now, when we say that, that is actually treating them employee versus the way we do emotional intelligence, how we support our volunteers is slightly different from staff. Having said that, if we all treated staff like we do with our volunteers, the organisation would even more flourish. Regular review notes to ensure that they remain voluntary. That is, that individual remains voluntary within the organisation. So hopefully some of you would have got some of those key points. So is anybody who had anything that would totally disagree with that, or thumbs up if you think that's a fair summary of all the things that you have included in your breakout room? Yeah, perfect, lovely. Again, it's just reconfirming, and hope you've had some good conversations about that as well. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes just to go off the screen for 5 minutes, grab yourself some cup of tea, water, just walk around to your room, whatever, get up from the screen for 5 minutes. It's now 22 minutes past 11, so I will be expecting people back just before 11:30, so that'll be 11:27. So I look forward to seeing you back here at that time. Thank you. Back at 11:27. That's perfect. Thank you. See you shortly. Quick. Bye. So moving on into the legal position of volunteers. So we've talked about the jigsaw puzzle, and now we're just going to look at the legal position of our volunteers. So although volunteers don't have the same legal rights as employees, we still have a duty of care to them, and we must follow laws that protect people, data, and safety. So these are the key ones I wanted to talk today about. So obviously health and safety is a priority for everybody, and then volunteers are covered under the Health and Safety Work Act 1974. Always think about how old that particular act is. It's an interesting act because it's overarching, talks about safety at work, and then you have underneath that various different acts relating to various areas of work, like protection of screens, protected clothing. So, but overarching the whole thing is the Safety at Work Act, which does include protecting and looking after your volunteers. You do owe volunteers the same duty of care as employees, and you should be having risk assessments where appropriate for your volunteers in their activities. You must ensure they are trained to provide the service at a safe level that they're doing. In some cases, you may be providing PPE to make sure that they are able to do again in safe ways and train them to use their equipment, safety procedures, and also, most importantly, as well, is knowing who to contact if they have concerns or there's incidents. So even though volunteers aren't staff, and if they are injured on your premises, the charity could still be liable. So it's important that you have them included in your health and safety. And also, I've had a summary for health and safety for volunteers specifically, so that's easy for people to understand the involvement of volunteers within the health and safety policy. You should also, related to this, have insurance in place in case there are injuries or accidents. There are several types of liability that, insurance should have in place, including public liability. You may have personal accident insurance. You may have motor insurance cover for your volunteers if your volunteers are driving on your behalf. And if there's an accident or incident while they're driving on your behalf, they may be taking out clients, they may be traveling to your volunteer. You ensure that you have the right cover for their roles within your motor insurance. There is also employee insurance that you may include your volunteers in, which I have done in the past, and notifying the volunteers, the insurance company on that. And you might have professional indemnity. So there's several types of insurance that you may have in place to ensure that volunteers are protected. And it is your responsibility to make sure that that is in place according to your organisation and the needs of your organisation. Safeguarding, obviously, that is very relevant, and that works two ways. For some organisations, they are working with vulnerable adults and children, and this safeguarding applies equally to volunteers who work with children, young people, or vulnerable adults as much as it does to employees. They should also go through the appropriate checks. We should all be doing DBS checks when necessary. Again, ensuring the legal side of this, that there is that you're only doing DBS checks on those roles and activities that need to be DBS checked, and also the level where appropriate as well. That is a whole area that obviously I'm not going to talk about now, but ensuring that you're doing good practice on DBS checking. And also, it's important that volunteers know and are trained how to recognise and report concerns as well. They know that there is a designated safeguarding lead, and making sure that safeguarding is everybody's responsibility, whether they are paid or unpaid. Now, the Equality Act of 2010, interestingly enough, volunteers are not explicitly covered by the Equality Act as workers. But obviously, many charities do adopt the principle of the Equality Act, ensuring fairness and inclusion. And they're ensuring that they are avoiding discrimination or any harassment or victimization in the recruitment and treatment of their volunteers, as much as their staff or anybody that comes into contact with their organisation. You may be ensuring that you are providing reasonable adjustments to your volunteers to make it much more inclusive. That's an important part, going back to your expenses as well, is ensuring that your volunteer program is inclusive. So you might be ensuring there's a reasonable adjustment if a volunteer comes to you and wishes to volunteer but may need extra support. So basically, even though it's not a strict legal requirement, equality, we know, is really good practice, and it protects both the organisation and the reputation. GDPR, obviously it's the GDPR, UK GDPR and Data Protection Act of 2018, and it applies how you handle volunteers' data. And so ensuring that the volunteers' personal data, their contact details, their DBS checks, etc., that they're stored securely and only used for volunteering purposes and only shared with those who have given consent, or they've given you consent to share it, or there is a legal reason why you may have to give some details out. But also it's important that volunteers themselves also are trained to respect the confidentiality of clients' data. So you may have data that volunteers are accessing and seeing it, and they need to know how to ensure that's kept securely, that it's kept in safe places, and they understand that the confidentiality is not about data only on computer screens, on laptops, etc. It's also about verbal. And sometimes people know people in communities and get very friendly with other people, and then talking about individual clients' cases, or individual volunteers have met other clients and other service users and talking about them personally about information to other external people. So ensuring that it's not just things on their phones or on laptops, it's also ensuring they understand that confidentiality is a verbal thing too. Now, if you're working alongside younger volunteers, legally under 14s can't formally volunteer without a parent's consent and supervision. And that's something that you can easily put in place if that's what you want to do. Some organisations have very good under 14 programmes for young people to get involved in their organisation, and it's a great introduction to volunteering. And also your 14 to 17-year-olds can volunteer, but also you have to make sure that it's a suitable task for this young person, and that you have done your risk assessment to ensure that the volunteer is protected because of their age, because they're under 18. Always getting that parents or guardians' consent and making sure that you make your safeguarding appropriately. So ensuring that people who are working alongside these volunteers understand they are working with young people, and therefore there is a safeguarding protection of those young people too. And when you work alongside young volunteers, they do bring great energy, but we do have a higher duty of care to younger people, younger volunteers. Some people ask me about volunteers and state benefits. What's the legal aspect of that? Well, basically, people on job seekers allowance or universal credit or any other benefit are allowed to volunteer. Many years ago, it was a very sort of like, oh, no, because they mustn't volunteer, they will lose their benefits, but actually are encouraged to volunteer as well. However, there are key rules behind this, and they must be generally volunteering, and this is obviously not replacing paid work. They also must be able to attend job interviews or training if required. And again, going back to that out-of-pocket expenses, they only can be reimbursed in that way. If you've got any questions about volunteers and the state benefit, you can always check the government website, which is called Volunteering While Getting Benefits. So again, just making sure you're keeping them very clear in the volunteering sphere while they're volunteering for you. But it's, again, a great opportunity to learn new skills, confidence, and you're widening your network of volunteers. But just being ensured that the legal position of when you're taking on volunteers with state benefit, on state benefit. So to help when we're thinking about clarity between volunteers and staff is actually having some of these processes and resources within your organisation. Having clear volunteer policies when appropriate really reflects them as unpaid support and their unpaid status. It really confines their boundaries, ensures protection of the organisation while also providing guidance, support and recognition for their contribution. This very often gets blurred within organisations about when a volunteer policy should be a volunteer policy and when you can include volunteers in staff policies. So for me, something like safeguarding is very much the same for whether you're a staff member, etc., or a volunteer. So you would include your volunteers in your staff and your safeguarding. If you're now talking about your grievance policy, that would be a very different policy to your volunteers. You would be dealing that more problem solving. You would have a separate direction, because the grievance policy would be very different from a volunteer to member of staff. Having a handbook is a really good guide for volunteers, and it really summarises again that they are very much in that group of volunteers. And it's a core guide for them. It covers their roles, responsibilities, expectations, again, about health and safety, and also the organisation's values as well. It really helps volunteers understand expectation, how they fit into the organisation. The thing about handbook, though, you must keep that up to date. And so some people, it's lovely to have a hard copy. And in the past, I've printed off loads of handbooks that have been in hard copy. But this day and age, with so much cost against printing, and actually is that very good for the environment, sometimes handbooks are available through people's websites, and therefore you can keep them up to date easier when policies and things like that change. We talked a lot about the volunteer agreement, and as I say, some people have them, majority do people to have them, and they are on this non-contractual agreement, and it clarifies the expectation, as we referred to earlier on. So you talk about the time commitment, the support you might be giving them, and ensuring that this keeps them, again, away from the contract relationship, but it's an agreement between the both of you, and it does not create an employment rights, but protects both sides of the parties. We've talked about, again, about volunteer expenses, but having a volunteer policy is really important. It explains the importance of why embracing reasonable out-of-pocket expenses, so that volunteering is accessible to everyone. So we talked about earlier, you can include meals, travel, uniform, but it's important that you have a clear process for claiming expenses. Now, again, I've been in organisations, because the way the staff policy works, they'll have things like overnight expenses, travel, and things like that overseas. So having a very clear, defined policy for volunteers is sometimes easier to have, rather than involving the two together. So looking at what you have, you might consider it's easier to have one that is a volunteer expenses policy separately. And then within that, how they claim needs to be easy to do as well. Because bear in mind, they're not outlaying that money in the first place, and having to wait 2 months before you get it back, again, makes volunteering exclusive. It puts barriers up. So ensuring that's a quick, easy way for people to claim their expenses is really important. So making sure that volunteers know how they can do that. You can also prepay volunteers' expenses. It is a little bit more complex, in the sense that you may give somebody who has no money to be able to, or very little income to be able to do that up front, as long as A, they give you a receipt for the money, and B, return back any excess money they have not used. So it can be done, but if you've got a trail of what happened, receipts to prove it, you can do that. Also, to be inclusive, you may also provide vouchers. You can buy books of transport vouchers, which you own as an organisation, and you can give to individuals to access their volunteering if it's out in remote areas where they're not able to get in cars, but they use public transport. You can actually use things like vouchers. But you own them. You only give them out to the person, and it is relative for their role. So again, it's just making sure you're clear about it, and there's no extra money being given. It's not a flat rate. It is cost for the transport. We talked about DBS checks and about required certain roles, children, vulnerable adults, and making sure that is a very clear policy in place that you have, understanding the different levels regarding standard, enhanced, confidentiality. And also what's important is that you have an onboarding that reflects the volunteer journey, making sure it is different from the main staff one, that it's not, it's a welcoming experience, and you can do orientation, induction, shadowing, and it should reflect your volunteer journey and not a staff one, which can very often be very formal, compliance driven, and actually long term. So yours should be much more flexible and engaging. see your face, Stephen. Right. So I hope you found that useful. It was a bit of a quick one, but actually was thinking about what the 3 things that you would want to put in your handbook. Some of you might find that useful, and I hope you have opened up a bit of a conversation. We've got 10 minutes left of this particular session this morning, and it's been great. And I've got some very interesting questions, which we'll move straight into, because I think that's what's most probably is burning on people's minds. So would you like to ask me a question in the chat box?
Yes, no problem. So we've had several people asking around kind of copyright and intellectual property rights and whether it's relevant for volunteers. Can you ask volunteers to sign anything to that effect? There's no real context other than general research publications and presumably project-based volunteering.
Yes, you can ask your volunteers to sign it, because it is important to understand who owns that that information after it's been created. And very much often an organisation will want to, that's the whole point, they've asked them to do it. So yes, you can ask your volunteers to sign that particular around a very specific piece of work.
And can you ask volunteers to sign confidentiality agreements more generally?
Yes, you can get them to sign them, but again, it's understanding what they're signing and saying that they understand. I understand what I might have been asked of me, and I will fulfill that. So I'm agreeing to fulfill that. But again, it's part of their role. It's really important. Yes, you can put it as their agreement. You don't have to have a separate one. You can add it into your general agreement as well.
Lovely. We have got many questions, but there is another question around insurance. So quite often insurance have bottom ages, top ages for what they will insure people against. Quite often it can be 80. This particular organisation has a duty of care for those who are older than 80. What is our duty of care, sorry, for those older than 80 when their particular liability might end? What do you do for older volunteers, especially if there's an insurance implication?
I think it depends on their activity and what they're doing, because obviously an insurance company will want a list of the activities they're actually doing. So they're high risk in their activities. I'd be looking at changing what the roles are that they're doing if they're heavily high risk. Conversation with the insurance company. I've had many a conversation with the insurance company, because they can be quite sticky over the age of 75, particularly for drivers as well. If you complete a risk assessment and you show good practice, insurance companies are generally quite flexible if you have those conversations with them.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's a sort of a tailored risk assessment for that specific individual and their circumstances, isn't it? Yeah, lovely. There is a question here about expenses from a little bit earlier around kind of flat expense thresholds. So rather than flat rates that you're paying an individual, but presumably the thresholds that you might reimburse someone up to. Is there any guidance around that? Do you need to have a threshold? Yes. Victoria, any thoughts on that?
It depends on your budget, really. I've done this today on how much you have in your budget to be able to pay expenses. And it makes sense, because you could have a boundary in saying that we will pay expenses for a certain amount of mileage or a certain distance, or we only pay volunteers while they're volunteering rather than when they go to their volunteering. That's up to you as an organisation to implement according to your budget and to what you can afford to do. So yes, you can have caveat around that you're volunteering. It should be clearly stated in your volunteer policy so people are aware of that you will pay up to a maximum of X for travel, or as I say, traveling from to place to place. Just being very clear about it. But yes, you can have a limit on the type of volunteer expenses that you can pay.
And just, do people usually sort of lump the different types of expenses together in terms of their threshold, or can you have a different threshold for different things? What have you generally seen out and about, Victoria?
I've seen different ones. So things like lunch as well, up to £6.50 for lunch, for sandwiches. And then I've done travelling distance over 30, anything over 30. You can do a tapered, you could say up to 30 miles. And then after that, it drops down to 15 pence a mile. So even though they're not getting as much, you're actually still paying some. What I find really important, though, that it make it fair, so that it's the same for staff and volunteers. One of those things that I have come across is that we pay our staff 45 pence a mile going everywhere, but we pay our volunteers 15 pence a mile and only when they travel to their volunteering opportunity. It needs to be fair and equal across the board. So for me, making sure that's the point as well. You don't have very difference between your volunteers' expenses and what you pay a staff. Yes, absolutely. Things like lunches and travel can have different variations of limits.
Lovely. So this is a slightly longer one. So we're finding that some colleagues outside the volunteering team aren't fully aware of the legal boundaries around volunteering. I'm with you there, Harriet. We occasionally receive requests for volunteer roles that closely resemble paid positions or perhaps should be paid. Does anyone have advice for managing these kinds of requests and supporting staff to design appropriate volunteer roles? And lovely, our colleagues have been commenting in the chat, so make sure you have a read of those. But Victoria, anything from your perspective to add?
Yeah, there is about culture and education across the board for your organisation, as well as understand they're not here to replace directly. But having a conversation about what it is they want them to do, what is the risk involved in it, and really understanding what the activity is. For me, that's what I've done when people have come forward and said, I'd like to have a volunteer to do that role. Being very clear about perhaps that could be broken up into different roles. It's not one very clear, exactly like for like. Is the expectations much more volunteer orientated? So when someone comes to me, I would have that conversation about what do they want them to do, breaking it down, looking at the risk involved in that. Is this, and then having that true conversation, because you've got some facts and information. You can have a look at that jigsaw puzzle. Are you creating a volunteer role from what their requests are? They're expecting them to do this, expecting them to do that. So using your jigsaw, you could actually identify whether that is a role that is becoming more like a paid member of staff.
Fabulous. I've got a couple more questions. Can volunteer thank you events that are funded by the charity or the organisation be seen as payment?
So what was the first bit?
Can volunteer thank you events that are funded by the organisation be seen as payment?
No, no. It's really important to support our volunteers and thank you. It is an event to reward and recognise, and it's also about expectations. If you had a big event every Tuesday that was always the same, you might be building up expectations of, are we getting this? But actually, reward and recognition takes many, many forms, and having events like that are really, really important. No, I would say definitely not.
Lovely. And the last couple of questions, I'm afraid we're going to get to, but we might be able to see if Victoria would be able to answer some for us after the session. It's a bit of a biggie. So we've had two questions around clarifications of the definition of volunteer. One around volunteer on participant, particularly around kind of community engagement activity and the sort of seesaw between the two. And then the other one between volunteer and voluntary worker.
Both very juicy topics. Okay, so from my perspective, the volunteer participant is more sort of a little, it is a grey, but it's sort of more about they are getting something from that. They are participating in an activity. Rather than doing it for somebody else, they're getting a little bit more out of it. They're participating and supporting, giving their knowledge, etc. Maybe how can they explain this properly? They may be, it depends how you've set it up. Is there a small incentive for that person to do that activity and participation? There is a very, very close line between the two, and falling slightly in, it will depend upon your organisation and how you've set up your participation. It's about that risk again. Have you thought it through? What have you put in place for that person to be a participant? They are very, very, they're bedfellows. They are very close together. So effectively, there's no harm in having participants at all. Ensuring that those participants do not fall into the employment route would be something I'd be looking at. But whether they are a participant or volunteer, there's a very fine line. Volunteering tends to be at the end of the spectrum. And I suppose if you like, you've got your volunteer workers in there. One end, you've got what you're very, you like to say, you're pure volunteering. They come, they do it freely out of choice. And then you move slowly into the middle area. And the middle area, you'll have your volunteer workers who are doing things much more structured. They'll have more requirements in them, and they may have special hours they have to do. So a lot of people might fit into that worker. And also, you've got your engagement participants in that middle section. You also might have your employer volunteering volunteers in that little bit there. And that's all fine, as long as you're not moving them closer. So they're more in the middle than they are for your volunteers. So making sure you don't push them further towards the employment side of things. So it depends how you set them up, how clear you are with the guidance and how clear you are with expectations. So they are in the middle part, I would say, between your employees and your volunteers themselves. There's nothing wrong with having them, that's fine, but making sure you make sure they have the other bits of the jigsaw puzzle are very clearly defined as volunteer activity, not employee. Does that explain that enough?
I think so. We've had lots of conversations around voluntary worker, and I think everyone's quite nervous about accidentally straying into that territory. And Victoria and I were chatting about this yesterday, in fact, and we were sort of saying, have confidence really that if you are listening to the statements that we said earlier in the session around choice, flexibility, only maybe one part of your jigsaw straying into the slightly more formal range, then you'll have confidence that you're not going to get there. But it isn't an exact science, is it, Victoria?
No, and I just seen someone picked it up as you do when you talk about your employee volunteering, you package those people together. You can package your participants together and your volunteers, though they all sit within your volunteering program. They're all versions of a volunteer, and that's not to be scared of. That's to embrace that. We need to be more diverse, but as we keep saying, just make sure, just recheck and make sure that you're not moving too far towards the employee side.
And I think the other thing is HVG is here. So if you think that there is a piece of practice that you're a bit nervous about, that you're not sure about, touch base with any of the colleagues in the HVG family. That's partly what we're here to do. That it isn't an exact science. And sometimes we do need to soundboard with others. Oh, I'm not sure. Is this getting a little bit close to the line? So please do use your colleagues in the HVG network as well, because it is really, really valuable for that kind of debate and dialogue. I'm afraid, though, that we've hit time. We could have kept going for much, much longer. We'll have a look through, see if there's any other questions that haven't been answered, and we can come back to you on that. But before you go, it would be really lovely to hear where you're at right now. So I'm just going to send a short poll around, and hopefully if you're able to give me just 2 moments, you can complete this for us. And if there are specifics around this topic, we've covered a range of elements around kind of law and risk, especially so that you had a good coverage. But if there are specific areas that you think you'd like us to look at in more focus, please do email Heritage Volunteering Group, or you can email me directly, and we can look to factor these into the future programme. Because, as I say, what we wanted to do today was provide a really good base and overview, but there may be some topics you want to look at in a slightly more granular detail. So that leaves me just to say a huge thank you to Victoria for taking us through a gallop of that amazing kind of breadth of topic. I definitely feel far more reassured and positive about my practice, and I hope you all do too. And we hope you have a lovely rest of your Tuesday, and do, as I say, get in touch if there are other things you want us to pick up that we've loosely covered today. Have a lovely rest of your day, everyone. Take care.